Welcome to Modern History of Europe. Part 6. The Great War. 1. Advance and Stalemate, 1914. To sketch the reaction of the population to the declaration of war in August 1914, I best quote Eric Hobsbawm. Quote, "The governments were taken utterly by surprise, as were the opponents of war, by the extraordinary wave of patriotic enthusiasm with which their people appeared ready to plunge into a conflict in which at least 20 millions of them were to be killed and wounded, without counting the incalculable millions of births foregone and excess civilian deaths through hunger and disease. The French authorities had reckoned with 5 to 13% of deserters. In fact, only 1.5% dodged the draft in 1914. In Britain, 750,000 people volunteered in the first 8 weeks. A further million volunteered in the next 8 months. The Germans, as was generally expected, did not dream of disobeying orders. How will anyone be able to say we do not love our fatherland when after the war so many thousands of our good party comrades will say we have been decorated for bravery? Thus wrote a German social democratic militant, having just won the Iron Cross in 1914. In Austria, not only dominant people were shaken by the brief wave of patriotism. As Austrian socialist leader Victor Adler acknowledged, even in the nationality struggle, war appears as a kind of deliverance, a hope that something different will come. And even in Russia, where 1 million deserters had been expected, all but a few thousands of the 15 million disobeyed the call to the colors. Europeans were surprised by the moment of war, but no longer by the fact of war itself, to which Europe had become accustomed, like people who see a thunderstorm coming. Its coming was widely felt as a release and as a relief, especially by the young of the middle classes, men very much more than women, and less so by workers and least by peasants. Like a thunderstorm, the war broke the heavy closeness of expectation and cleared the air. It meant an end to the superficialities and the frivolities of bourgeois society. It meant an end to the boring gradualism of 19th century improvement, the tranquility and peaceful order that was the liberal utopia for the 20th century, and that Nietzsche had already prophetically denounced, together with all the pallid hypocrisy administered by mandarins. After a long wait in the auditorium, this war meant the opening of the curtain on a great and exciting historical drama in which the audience found itself to be the actors. It meant decision after a period of long tension as well." End quote. Now the reason why Germany demanded right of passage through Belgium, as we saw in the previous episode, was in a way typical for the elites of the German Empire throughout, and in a deeper sense it was typical of Germany itself. Germany was a perpetually insecure country, too big to be a traditional European power of the likes of Italy or France, but too small to compete with the Russian and American continental powers, or as yet with the British Empire. And it was a country with a chronically and perpetually insecure elite too, an elite that had the peculiar combination of vast and practically unrealizable ambitions to not merely European but to global hegemony, which were coupled to constant nagging doubts and occasionally a sense of despair on whether these vast ambitions were attainable. All that made the German elites particularly prone to a va-banque strategy of hazard, putting everything on one card. For if Germany played it safe, it could not foreseeably attain any of its huge goals. Americans could simply afford to wait to secure Britain's position as leading world power. Germany, however, had to make a leap into the dark for it. Now, in 1905, the chief of the German General Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen, as he pondered Germany's strategic situation, had a dilemma. Germany, with its 92 divisions, would likely have to fight a war against the Entente on two fronts with two enemies. France with 83 divisions and Russia with 104 divisions. Germany thus numerically narrowly outclassed France, and in armaments it far outclassed Russia, though it was numerically far inferior to it. But together these two opponents far outclassed Germany, even counting Austro-Hungary's 32 divisions in, of which at least 7 would however have to be deployed against Serbia. Germany's only advantage were its interior lines of communication. But defense was not really an option for her with these numerical odds, and it would have to defeat one of the two and severely maul the other. The Russians, however, could simply retreat into their vast hinterland, and a campaign against Russia was thus likely to become a protracted one. The Germans could in that case only leave a small force behind to guard against the French. Were the Germans to concentrate on the French, however, they could profit from the at least 6 weeks it would take the Russians to fully mobilize and deploy their army so as to concentrate all their troops against the French and hopefully defeat or at least severely maul them in the meantime. German High Command rightly expected the French would likely mass their entire army on the Alsatian-Lorrainian frontier, which they had heavily fortified as well. Attacking there, it was hence highly unlikely they would be able to defeat the French within 6 weeks. Instead, Schlieffen proposed the German army should march round the main French army through Belgian Wallonia and through Dutch Limburg, then sweep through northern France, where the sleeve of the last grenadier was to rub the English Channel, as Schlieffen famously prescribed, and then, bypassing Paris, for Paris was protected by a ring of fortresses and it would require a prolonged siege, and then the army was to wheel eastwards, so as to envelope the French army on the Lorraine border. There were 2 problems with Schlieffen's plan that could be predicted from the very outset. First, the plan depended on everything going according to exact clockwork precision. Belgium had to be traversed within 2 weeks. The armies in northern France had to be beaten within 2 weeks, and the Lorraine border had to be reached within another 2 weeks, and then French resistance would have to crumble immediately. And whilst the General Staff had for the Belgian phase timed everything up to the last minute and up to the last track of railway, for military operations and planning then entirely relied on calculations how much supplies could be fetched by railway, once the troops began to approach Paris, the plan's instructions became increasingly vague, and for the last phase, the turn eastwards, there were no instructions at all, because, good soldier as he was, Schlieffen himself realized there were likely to be unforeseen hitches and unforeseen events in the plan in the meantime, that there would be friction, as the great strategist Clausewitz called it in the early 19th century. For, as Clausewitz had warned, war is simple, but simple things in war are difficult. Due to this friction, Schlieffen was not even himself sure his plan would quite work out as he had planned. Yet it would have to go by that clockwork precision to succeed. Any day of delay might doom it. And second, there was the minor problem that if Germany violated Belgian and Dutch neutrality, this would certainly lead to a British declaration of war, and a British participation in the war might doom Germany's prospect of winning a long war. However, Schlieffen counted that the 5 divisions that Britain would likely send to the continent were too few in number to have any major immediate impact on the start of the war. Belgium would scantily have to resist too, and the Netherlands not at all, for the plan to succeed. With that many uncertain variables, it was a risky plan. But by 1910 it had become Germany's only plan. Preparing for war meant carrying out the Schlieffen plan. And worse, the plan began to dictate Germany's diplomacy as well, so that war with Russia meant mobilizing for war with France, and that meant an ultimatum to Belgium, and that entailed war with Britain in turn. Furthermore, as the General Staff had been rehearsing the Schlieffen plan for years, its general outline was well known to both the Belgian and the French intelligence. Under Schlieffen's successor since 1911, Helmut von Moltke, the plan was further weakened, and thus its possible success further hazarded by 3 things. First, Moltke decided to respect Dutch neutrality, which meant that the entire mass of the German army, 2.5 million men, would have to be squeezed through the narrow corridor of Liège with its few bridges and 1 railroad, which would inevitably ensue in chaos and delays, even if the Belgians there would not resist. That would make it virtually impossible to keep to schedule. Second, the completion of new railways in Russian Poland would likely ensue in the Russians having more troops ready on the East Prussian border than was the case in Schlieffen's time. And though Schlieffen had recommended evacuating Eastern Prussia, that was indefensible anyway, the Cossack should under no circumstance commit unspeakable deeds on blonde German maidens. So von Moltke had to station more troops there too, thus severely weakening the armies in the west. And third, there was the extension of the time of service of the French troops, in addition to which the British and French armies, as we saw, had in 1912 arranged for that deployment of British forces in northern France, where they were to prevent the possible German push through Belgium that the French High Command dreaded. Yet that imminent threat of an advance through Belgium was for the French headquarters no reason to change its plan for attacking in Lorraine all the same, as everyone in France and Germany knew they were going to do for ages too, and for which the Germans had made elaborate preparations to resist it. The French hoped instead to envelope the Germans by their attack through Lorraine, and then perhaps march to the north and so surprise the German armies on the Belgian border, or something like that. For the supposed French Plan 17 came really down to a variant on Napoleon's motto, on s'engage et plus on voit. You just start fighting and then you see what you'll do later. All this meant that the German army was now to carry out a very complicated maneuver, in which it moreover was to expose its flank to a possible counter-attack from Paris in the teeth of an enemy of approximately equal number, 95 German divisions against 92 Belgian, French and British, and that it was to accomplish all that on a very tight time schedule, lest the Russians would already stand in Königsberg, if not in Berlin. Small wonder Van Moltke had a nervous breakdown a few weeks into the war and had to be replaced by Minister of War Friedrich von Falkenhayn instead. Now, partly because of its superb fighting capability, partly because of the skills of the foot soldiers of the Imperial German Army and their initial enthusiasm and high morale, partly due to its superb equipment that in World War I consistently outclassed that of all other warring parties, and partly too because the German General Staff had been planning the march through Belgium in every detail for more than a decade. But first and foremost, because the French army did the Germans the favor of indeed attacking with the whole army in Lorraine, which attack turned into a bloody failure, and thus they did not reinforce the Belgian front. The first phase of the Schlieffen plan went, allowing for a week delay, well. The Germans succeeded too, pushing back the British and French troops in northern France, on which they, accompanied by 2.5 million refugees who clogged all roads, fell back towards Paris. But critically, they were still in good marching and in good fighting order, so that completely unlike the general panic which gripped the French forces in World War II, only a very few surrendered during the Great Retreat, as it was known, of 1940. As the Germans noted, though the French army had retreated, they had taken less than 7,000 prisoners, a sure sign the French were not beaten. A battered but capable French army thus fell back towards Paris, towards its base of supply, while the pursuing Germans came in increasing difficulties as they began to approach Paris, as their troops were, after 6 weeks of continuous marching and fighting, completely exhausted, and they were increasingly badly supplied too, as the railway engineers had not been able to repair the railroads and the railheads quickly enough to keep up with the advancing troops. Parts of the German army were now out of touch with one another, and 8 divisions on the critical western flank had been sent to East Prussia, so that the Entente forces were now actually superior in numbers to the Germans, and they were both better supplied and less fatigued. Nonetheless, as the French threatened to succumb to their old 1870 trauma of being hopelessly beaten, although the army was still in the field, had the Germans now marched on Paris, the entire French resistance might have crumbled, and the government was in fact already packing to move to Bordeaux. But instead, as Paris was, as said, surrounded by redoubtable fortifications that would require a long siege, the Germans now decided to make their plan eastwards turn, so as to trap the French army on the Lorraine border, thus offering the French their flank, and additionally a gap had opened between the German armies. That offered the French Supreme Commander, Joseph Joffre, whose legendary sang-froid indeed saved France during the Great Retreat, as everybody round him collapsed of nerves and Joffre alone remained calm, that offered Joffre the opportunity for a counter-attack on the German flank along the Marne River from Paris, the troops from Paris being famously fed there by Paris taxis. The Germans then fell back on the Aisne River and both armies started to dig in. The Schlieffen plan, the only real chance the Germans had on winning the war, had failed. There followed a further advance of the Germans in Belgium and an attempt of both armies to an enveloping movement that finally stalled very close to the North Sea at the First Battle of Ypres, Dixmuiden for Belgians or Langemark for Germans, between German volunteers and the Belgian, the British and parts of the British Indian Army in October. That battle cost Belgium its entire army. By November, movement on the Western Front had stalled, and the troops now dug in that line of trenches that were to form the front line on the Western Front for the next 4 years. Although on that moment the generals thought those trenches were mere temporary shelters and that fighting in the open would recommence next year. The French army was confident it could and would break through the German trench lines in 1915, as the Entente armies gained an increasing numerical advantage over the Germans, who had to transfer most of their army to the east, and as the British had started a slow military build-up on the Western Front that eventually brought their numbers of divisions from 4 up to 34, though most of their troops would only be ready in 1916. Far earlier than the Germans had expected, 2 Russian armies had marched into East Prussia in August, and as mentioned already, with these 2 armies no longer merely threatening Königsberg but Berlin itself, Moltke had perforce to rush troops eastwards, who were put under the command of the elderly, in fact already pensioned, Field Marshal Oskar von Hindenburg. His chief of staff was at a mere 43 for an officer in 1914, outlandishly young staff officer who had, despite his tender age, already distinguished himself at the battle for Liège, who was named Erich Ludendorff. As the Russian armies had got all spread out and all mixed up during their advance, and as the poor quality of staff work of the Tsarist armies was legendary, the two armies, for example, did not communicate in code, so that the Germans could listen in on all Russian messages and they exactly knew where the Russians were at all times, yet the Russians had not a clue where the enemy was, and as said, often not even a clue where the other Russians were. The Germans, therefore, managed to concentrate on and to attack with their entire army one of the two Russian armies not supported by the other. They suffered a devastating defeat in a battle that the Germans, with the traditional prerogative for the victor to choose the name of a battle, called the Battle of the Tannenberg, after a battle in 1410 in which the Slavic Poles had defeated the very Germanic Teutonic Knights, for all of which Germany now had supposedly taken revenge, though the first Battle of Tannenberg was not even fought nearby. The Second Army suffered an even worse defeat in October in the so-called Battle of the Masurian Lakes. However, those German victories were compensated by the severe defeats the Austrian army had meanwhile suffered against the Russians. First, during their attempted advance into Russian Poland that had nearly ushered in a hasty retreat as the Austrian armies were threatened by encirclement by a larger Russian army. And then in a series of gigantic battles in November and December, the so-called winter battles of the Carpathian Mountains, in which the Austrian armies were forced to cede Galicia, including the key fortress city of Przemysl, after 2 sieges lasting 6 months in total, that cost some 40,000 lives and have somewhat of the same significance for Hungary as Verdun has for France. And the Austrians had to retreat to the Carpathian passes that give direct access into the Hungarian plains. So that by January the Germans had to rush in troops to save Austria, and they had to go on the defensive on the western front. The German High Command had always had little trust in the Austrians, even as the war broke out, and by 1915 the Germans and the Austrians were barely on speaking terms anymore. Or rather, Falkenhayn now dictated Konrad von Hotzendorf what he was to do on the Eastern Front, as Falkenhayn had meanwhile become convinced that if von Hotzendorf acted on his own, he would merely be defeated. Falkenhayn famously likened the Austrian alliance to being shackled to a corpse. After having suffered an even worse defeat in July 1916, with 600,000 losses and more than 300,000 Austrian prisoners, the Austrian army was effectively out of the war on the Eastern fronts. The Germans had then once again to rush in reinforcements, and that doomed the almost victorious German offensive at Verdun, as we shall see, and it forced them to fight the British offensive on the Somme in July 1916 at a tremendous numerical disadvantage. 1 German to 3 British soldiers. Though the British historians have done their utmost to cover this up for the last 100 years and declare that battle a strategic victory at least, the battle on the Somme was close to a British defeat, as the British had been utterly unable to force their way through German defenses, which was what the British commander Douglas Haig had promised to achieve. Had the Austrian army, however, not collapsed in July 1916, the British would surely have suffered utter defeat on the Somme. By the end of 1916, on the Eastern Front, what remained of the Austrian troops had effectually been incorporated into the German army. By 1917, the Austrians even wore the same uniforms and the same helmets as the German troops. For to put them on the Eastern Front under German command and tight-lace the Austrian within the German troops appeared to be practically the only way to keep the Austrians standing, rather than that they immediately ran away, as they otherwise would, or that their Slavic soldiers would go over to their Russian Slavic brethren en masse, so the Germans complained. Yet that the Austrians became ever more mere German stand-ins also meant that the Entente became increasingly embittered towards Austria. The double monarchy was increasingly seen as merely a German pawn, and repeated soundings of the new Austrian Emperor Charles in 1916, in 1917 and in 1918 that he might well be willing to sign a separate peace agreement on a status quo ante base, and that he was itching to desert his supposed German ally if the Entente only kept his monarchy alive, were contemptuously turned down by the Entente. Whereas at the beginning of the war there thus was substantial support amongst Entente diplomats for keeping a double monarchy alive that was, probably deservedly, seen as a factor for stability in Eastern and Central Europe, those diplomats, as they became increasingly hostile to those Habsburg puppets of the Germans, were now willing to listen to such Czech nationalists as sociology professor Thomas Masaryk, exiled in Paris, who pleaded that a new joint Czech and Slovak state, Czechoslovakia, was to be founded on the territory of the monarchy. Or they were more willing to listen to the old pleas of the Serb government that was now in exile in Albania after a defeat it had suffered against Austrian and Bulgarian forces in the winter of 1915, in 1917, and now joined by Croatian oppositional groups, that Croatia and Slovenia were to be joined with Serbia and Montenegro, so as to constitute Strossmayer's grand Yugoslavian dream, including, critically, Dalmatia, that was promised by the Entente to Italy as well, and the Slavonic-speaking part of Istria, including the port of Rijeka, that had also been promised to Italy by the Entente. Last but not least, Serbia, or New Yugoslavia, was to get Macedonia too, although Bulgaria had in 1915 declared war on Serbia so as to obtain Macedonia. Or again, they were now willing to listen to the pleas of Polish exiles that Austrian Poland and Galicia were to be joined to a new rump Polish state that the Germans had established on the territory of formerly Russian Poland or Congress Poland in 1916, when they did not have to count with Russian territorial demands at Austria's expense any longer, as the Russian Revolution had obliterated all Russia's original war aims. Effectively, by mid-1917, Entente diplomats settled on the nationality principle as the guideline for their future diplomacy. a nationality principle that was from now on to override the old principle of Austria, the Hausmacht. The Austrian monarchy was hence to cease to exist, and its territory was to be carved up into smaller states that would, or better that should, each represent a nationality that was defined by language. Now, respectively, the Battle of the Tannenberg and the string of Austrian defeats, so that by March 1915, Austria appeared to be effectively hovering on the brink of collapse, from which it was merely temporarily saved by Germany, brought two more powers into the war. First, the Ottoman Empire entered the war in November, after the string of Russian defeats. It had not only old scores to settle with Serbia and with Greece, but with Russia as well. And it hoped that with the Russian armies distracted by the war with Germany, it would now be able to triumphantly advance on the Caucasus and then join up with fellow Muslim and fellow Turks of Azerbaijan there. That campaign got stalled in the Arctic cold of the Caucasus winter, and the Ottoman soldiers literally froze to death by the thousands or starved to death by the thousands. For the Ottoman army was short of virtually everything, from munitions, firewood to clothes and food. And Ottoman commanders were even more careless with lives of their soldiers as Russian ones were. Indeed, they had to be, for compared to the Ottoman army, even the Tsarist army was a high-tech army. And as the Ottoman Empire was subjected to total maritime blockade and any imports of foodstuffs were curtailed, by 1917 hundreds of thousands perished of hunger in the Ottoman Empire. The second power enticed into the war later on was Italy. Although Italy was bound by the Triple Alliance to both Germany and Austria, it had first declared itself neutral. As by the terms of the Triple Alliance, Italy had only to help Austria and Germany if they were attacked, and not if they had declared war first. And then it gradually began to inch towards the Entente. For as the Austrians suffered defeat after defeat, they appeared easy prey. The Italian army would surely in no time stand in Vienna, many in Italy thought, and then they could dictate terms to Austria. As the chief ideologist of the fascist movement, Giovanni Gentile, afterwards sketched the issues of this war, it was as follows, quote, "For one kind of person, the important point was to fight the war, either on the side of Germany or against Germany, but in either event to fight the war, without regard to specific advantages. To fight the war in order that at last the Italian nation, that was created by favorable diplomatic conditions rather than by the will of its people to be a nation, might receive its test in blood. Such a test as only war can bring, by uniting all citizens in a single thought, a single passion, a single hope, emphasizing to each individual that they all have something in common, something transcending private interests. Yet this was the very thing that frightened the other kind of, the prudent man, the realist, who had a clear view of the mortal risks a young, inexperienced, badly prepared nation would run in such a war, and who also saw a significant point, that all things considered, a bargaining neutrality might surely win the country tangible rewards too, maybe as great as victorious participation itself. On the eve of the war, those two Italian characters stood facing each other. scowling and irreconcilable. The one on the aggressive, asserting itself ever more forcefully through the various organs of public opinion. The other was on the defensive, offering resistance through Parliament, a Parliament that in those days still seemed to be the basic repository of state sovereignty. Civil conflict seemed inevitable in Italy, and civil war was in fact averted only because the king took advantage of his prerogatives and unilaterally declared war on the central powers. Yet, whereas the northern elites of Italy might have been swayed by nationalistic fervor to declare a war that was generally conceived as a betrayal of Italy's allies in other countries, and even British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith rated the Italians as the most contemptible of all powers, Sicilian or Calabrian peasants did not care why they should be torn from their fields to liberate South Tyrol or Istria. Those were places they could not even identify on the map, and their supposed compatriots, even the supposed Italian speakers of Istria, spoke a language they could not understand. Now the Italians had expected that on their declaration of war in May 1915, the Austrian monarchy would collapse. Instead, this low step in the back by a former ally occasioned a patriotic rally to the monarchy, not merely in Austria, but even in Slovenia and in Croatia, where the Italians were and are generally still disliked. And unlike the very unpopular war with Russia, and unlike the even more unpopular war with Serbia, which was after all the Austrian Goliath attacking the small Slav Daniel, this one was generally and genuinely popular. As Czech recruits on the Eastern Front sang, "We march behind the flag against Russia, but we do not know why." Yet in this war against Italy, the Austrians were the defenders against an unprovoked attack. And even the Czechs knew why they fought, though the Czechs were admittedly the least motivated troops the Austrian army had, whereas the ones from rural Austria were far more willing to die for Franz Joseph, and the Poles were fighting for the re-establishment of their homeland. So that the leader of the militant Polish nationalist movement, Józef Pilsudski, led a Polish detachment fighting on Austria's side. And unlike their at best indifferent performance against the Russians and their bad performance against the Serbians, who in 1914 routed a far stronger Austrian army, the Austrians performed excellently against the Italians, though to be sure the horrendous terrain contributed to the Italians making no progress whatsoever in the next 2 years of war as well. This new war, after all, was either fought in the Alp mountains or in the rugged terrain of the Kars Massif that separates Slovenia from Italy. In this Italian theater were added to the normal horrors of the First World War machine guns or shells, avalanches and razor-sharp flying stones, and after 5 consecutive offensives on the Isonzo River, the Italians had still made no progress whatsoever. Yet that was not merely the case for the Italians. In March and in October 1915, the French army, that hoped to profit from its momentary vast superiority in both manpower and material over the Germans, made 2 massive assaults in Champagne, attacks which came no further than their own trenches. For whereas for a long time the French continued to perceive trenches as mere temporary staging points for an advance, the German army that was ordered to dig in to withstand an attack by an enemy now vastly superior in everything, had elevated trench warfare to a science by 1950, with first, second and third line trenches connected by communication trenches, ladders to the parapets, several feet deep dugouts so as to protect troops from artillery fire, zigzagging trenches so as to prevent crossfire across trenches, headquarters housed in concrete pillboxes, concealed and camouflaged artillery positions, telephone lines to the front trenches that were hidden underground, trench periscopes, and so on and on. The French army, assaulting such formidable fortresses, was slaughtered, losing nearly 500,000 men to comparatively light German losses. Those French and Italian failures allowed the Germans, with some Austrian assistance, to launch from March 1915 onward a grand offensive against the Russians, in which they recaptured Galicia in March. And in July they started a great offensive in central Poland, with nearly equal numbers of troops as the Russians, and vastly outnumbering and outclassing them in artillery. And as we shall see, this was the critical weakness of the Tsarist armies in the First World War throughout. Furthermore, even if they had guns, they had commonly no shells to fire with them, for the Tsarist armies were chronically short of munitions as well, as we shall see later in more detail. The Russian soldiers, in that for them dreadfully hot summer of 1915, had the sensation of being up against an enemy who as much outclassed them as the Americans outclassed the Iraqis in the Second Gulf War. And much as the Iraqis, the Russians suffered dreadful losses too against an enemy they barely saw. Their ranks were simply chewed up by German artillery before they had even seen a German. By August, the Russian armies in Poland were in headlong retreat, had suffered 300,000 casualties, and the German and Austrians had taken more than 1 million prisoners, though von Falkenhayn was, wisely, not contemplating any invasion of Russia proper by 1916. The Germans had still conquered Warsaw, Brest-Litovsk and Vilnius, where Germany, as mentioned, re-established the state of Poland.